From Privilege to Penalty: Understanding the Termination of Presidential Immunity. In this blog post, we will delve into the complexities of presidential immunity and the recent termination of this privilege. We will discuss the history and evolution of presidential immunity, as well as the controversies and debates surrounding its use. We will also examine the different forms of presidential immunity and how they have been both beneficial and problematic. Through this analysis, we hope to gain a greater understanding of the nuances and consequences of terminating presidential immunity and the impact it may have on future leaders and the political landscape. The evolution of presidential immunity from privilege to penalty. Presidential immunity, or the protection from legal prosecution for actions taken while in office, has been a hotly debated topic throughout American history. From President Lincoln's use of executive power during the Civil War to Richard Nixon's infamous Watergate scandal and more recent events like Donald Trump's election campaign, there have been numerous instances where the limits and extent of presidential immunity have come into question. The scope of presidential immunity is defined by the Constitution, which states that a sitting president cannot be indicted or arrested while in office. This privilege was put in place to prevent political enemies from using the justice system to disrupt a presidency. However, it does not mean that presidents are above the law; they can still face consequences after leaving office.
The extent of presidential immunity has also evolved over time as different administrations have pushed its boundaries. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus rights during the Civil War without congressional approval. Similarly, Franklin Roosevelt used his broad war powers to intern Japanese Americans during World War II. These actions sparked controversy and raised questions about how far presidential immunity could stretch. Termination of presidential immunity occurs when a president leaves office either through resignation or at the end of their term. At this point, he or she no longer holds any legal protections from prosecution for their actions while in office and can be held accountable for any wrongdoing under criminal law.
In recent years, there has been increased scrutiny on presidential immune privileges following high-profile scandals such as Watergate and Clinton's impeachment proceedings. The impact of these events led Congress to pass legislation limiting some aspects of executive privilege, including restrictions on national security leaks under the Patriot Act. However, with the election of Donald Trump came new challenges surrounding presidential immunity. While facing multiple investigations into his administration's dealings with foreign governments prior to taking office and potential conflicts of interest within his businesses while serving as president, Trump continues to assert his right to invoke executive privilege as necessary despite mounting pressure from Congress and the public.
In conclusion, throughout American history there has been a constant evolution of presidential immunity from privilege to penalty as presidents have tested its limits and faced scrutiny for their actions while in office. The boundaries of this protection have been refined through legislation and court decisions. Whether it be Lincoln during the Civil War or Trump's recent presidency, the scope and extent of presidential immunity will continue to be debated as America's political landscape evolves. The controversies and debates surrounding presidential immunity. The concept of presidential immunity has been a highly debated and controversial topic throughout American history. This comprehensive guide will delve into the controversies and debates that have surrounded this issue, examining its scope, extent, termination, and implications for past, current, and future presidents. Scope of presidential immunity. Presidential immunity refers to the legal protection given to the president from any criminal or civil liability while in office. This privilege is based on the premise that the president should be able to carry out their duties without fear of personal legal repercussions. However, there has been much debate over where exactly this immunity begins and ends. Some argue that it only applies to official actions taken by the president in their role as head of state, while others believe it extends beyond this to include personal conduct as well.
Extent of presidential immunity. Another area of controversy surrounding presidential immunity is its extent. Does it cover all crimes committed by a sitting president or are certain offenses exempt? The Supreme Court has ruled that a sitting president cannot be indicted for federal crimes but can face impeachment proceedings by Congress. However, there remains ambiguity around whether they can face charges at a state level. For example, During his presidency, Richard Nixon was not charged with any federal crimes related to Watergate but did resign after facing potential impeachment charges.
Termination of presidential immunity. While most agree that presidential immunity lasts until the end of their term in office, there is disagreement over what happens once they leave office. In past cases such as President Bill Clinton's Monica Lewinsky scandal or former President George W. Bush's alleged war crimes, lawsuits were filed against them after they left office but were ultimately dismissed due to lack of jurisdiction. This raises questions about whether former presidents should continue to enjoy some form of legal protection once their term has ended.
End of presidential immune privileges. With every new administration comes changes in policies and practices, meaning an end may come for some presidential immune privileges altogether under different presidents. For example, during the Civil War, President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and only Congress could reinstate it. This sparked much debate over whether or not a president has the power to suspend basic rights for national security reasons.
Halt to president's legal protection. In recent years, there have been calls to re-examine the extent of presidential immunity in light of some of President Donald Trump's actions and behavior both before and during his presidency. The ongoing investigation into potential collusion with Russia during his election campaign has brought this issue to the forefront as critics argue that no one is above the law, even the president. As we can see, throughout American history there have been numerous controversies and debates surrounding presidential immunity, from its scope and extent to its termination and implications for past and present presidents. As our country continues to evolve politically, these discussions will undoubtedly continue as we grapple with how best to balance legal protection with accountability for those holding our highest office. From Watergate to Trump's election campaign, presidential immunity in the spotlight. Presidential immunity has been a hot topic in recent years, with controversies surrounding the Watergate scandal and President Trump's election campaign. As such, it is important to fully understand the scope of presidential immunity and its extent, as well as how and when it can be terminated or come to an end. In this comprehensive guide, we will delve into these issues and discuss the implications for current and future presidents.
The scope of presidential immunity refers to what actions are protected under this privilege. Historically, this has been interpreted to mean that a president cannot be criminally prosecuted while in office for any conduct related to their official duties. This stems from the idea that prosecuting the highest office in the land would disrupt governance and potentially weaken national security. However, there have been debates over whether this extends to civil lawsuits or investigations by special counsel. The extent of presidential immunity is another point of contention. While most agree that it covers actions taken within the scope of official duties, there is debate over whether it also protects a president before they take office or after they leave office. Some argue that pre-presidency activities should not be covered since they do not pertain to governing duties, while others believe post-presidency protection maintains continuity and stability for former leaders.
Termination of presidential immunity can occur through impeachment or resignation from office. Impeachment allows Congress to hold a trial against a sitting president for high crimes and misdemeanors, which may result in removal from office if convicted by two-thirds majority vote in the Senate. Resignation would likely involve negotiating terms with prosecutors regarding ongoing investigations or potential charges after leaving office. There are other ways presidential immunity privileges may come to an end as well. For example, courts have found that executive privilege does not extend beyond confidentiality during impeachment proceedings. Therefore, incriminating evidence could still be used against them afterward without violating constitutional protections afforded under executive privilege statutes.
With regards to Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War, it was deemed constitutional due to the national emergency at hand. However, this precedent has been debated as some view it as an abuse of power and a violation of individual rights. Additionally, presidential actions under the War Powers Act or the Patriot Act have also raised concerns about executive overreach and potential limits to presidential immunity. In light of recent events surrounding President Trump's election campaign and subsequent investigations, there has been renewed scrutiny on how far presidential immunity can extend. The argument has been made that criminal acts committed before taking office should not be protected under this privilege. This raises questions about accountability for past actions and whether any president is truly above the law.
As we navigate these complex issues surrounding presidential immunity, it is important to remember the principles upon which our Constitution was founded. While granting certain protections and privileges to our leaders, it also emphasizes checks and balances to prevent abuses of power. As such, debates over scope, extent, termination and limitations on presidential immunity will continue as we strive for a fair balance between protecting our democracy while holding our leaders accountable for their actions. In conclusion, the termination of presidential immunity is an important aspect of our political system that has evolved over time. From the scope and extent of presidential immunity to the end of its privileges, we can see how changes in our society and government have influenced this concept. Looking at historical events such as Lincoln and Watergate, as well as modern acts like the War Powers Act and Patriot Act, helps us understand why this issue is so crucial in our current political climate. As we continue to navigate through different administrations and presidential actions, it is vital that we understand what this termination of immunity means for our country and how it may affect future leaders. With a better understanding of this topic, we can engage in meaningful discussions and hold those in authority accountable for their actions. Ultimately, it is up to us as citizens to ensure that our democracy remains strong by educating ourselves on issues like this one, from privilege to penalty, so that we can make informed decisions about who leads our nation.